Hello, my name is Paul Gilbert. I'm the president of the Compassionate Mind Foundation, and this is a Welcome to Creating a Compassionate World series. Now, today, it's a privilege and an honor to welcome somebody who's done an extraordinary amount of work on the dark side of humanity. I'll tell you a little bit about him. So, Dan is a writer and activist. In 1983, he co founded the pioneering political arts organization Platform in Cambridge, where he studied English literature, as well as working with Platform over many years on the human rights and environmental impacts of corporation. He has also developed radical initiatives in adult education and has lectured internationally on the subject of the desk killer. After more than a decade of research, aided by a major award from the London Foundation, he embarked on the writing of I, You, We, Them. He currently divides his time between Northwest Wales, which has been blown by a gale recently, and East London, where he shares his time with a family of foxes. So that's and Dan's really going to address something which in the Compassionate Foundation is extremely important. We understand that compassion is when we are sensitive to the suffering of others and we are motivated to do something about it. But callousness is when we are insensitive to the suffering of others. We may even be complicit in causing the suffering of others, but in our self-interest, we do it anyway. And then cruelty is actually the enjoyment of the suffering of others. And therefore, it's very important we understand the psychology behind these processes because both callousness and cruelty are really the dark side of the mind. And when we engage in callous and cruelty, we really have lost our capacity for humanity big time. And when callousness and cruelty dominate the mind, we are a very dangerous species indeed. Our history is a history of atrocities and horrors and wars and tortures and Roman games and all gladiatorial games and so on. So what the book, let me talk to you a little bit about the book, because this is quite a remarkable book. I mean, it's a big book. There's a hell of a lot in it, and it reads like a personal journey through a history of callousness, really. But Mark Cocker from The Spectator says of the book, this is a remarkably powerful book. It entails a dogged and worldwide pursuit of the desk killer. And in fact, if you read the book, you'll see that Dan's traveled the world, really, visiting various locations and talking to various people, and really helps us understand the government functionary of or business executive whose decisions so often cost human lives. The model of this remote control assassin is Hitler's architect Albert Speer, but the German story is assumed in a far more compelling and modern investigation of the collective amnesia which is so often operates in the telling of national histories, including our own. But this is really important because when we look at our history, such as the history of slavery or whatever it is, the actual horrors and the extraordinary cruelties and the emotional textures of those cruelties get rather painted out. Just a few other key things to know about the book. It was a Washington Book of the Year, Spectator Book of the Year, and some of the other things that have been said about it. Great books never occur out of a desire for greatness, but often out of a possessed persistence in the face of a chosen, immensely difficult task. And I would have to say that absolutely describes this book. It's meticulous, clinical, and sobering, a shockingly important and incisive book. I, You, We, Them is uniquely gripping. It's a uniquely gripping journey around the landscapes of mass murder. So this is heavy stuff. If you start to get into this book, it's extraordinarily powerful, a guarantee that the truth will be heard. And I think that's absolutely crucial because it's people like Dan that keep our eyes open to the realities that humans are potentially a very nasty, dangerous species indeed. So it's a testament, both mighty and meticulous, a devastating case for the prosecution against which there is no defense. The book should be compulsory reading. I think it absolutely should be compulsory reading. And so now it's an honor, as I say, it is an honor really to welcome Dan to talk to us about his journey into the dark side, what he's discovered from that, and possibly, hopefully, some ideas about how we can move from this extraordinary potential for callousness to one for compassion. So, Dan, welcome. And I now hand to you to tell us, how did you get into this work? Because it's quite it's intense and it's very powerful, and you must have been subjected to some real horrors over the years.
Well, thanks so much, Paul, and also thank you for the chance to address the conference in October, which I found really fascinating and very, very engaging. Yeah, I mean, the journey with this material has really been pretty much the whole of my adult life. I talked at the conference about the beginning of it was watching this remarkable film by Claude Lanzmann, this 9-hour epic film about the Holocaust. And there was a memorandum read out in that film which blew my mind when I was 21 watching that film. I could not believe it in terms of it's a memorandum which is from one sort of bureaucrat to another about how to make the Saurer lorries into more effective mobile gas chambers. And that was such a, but the language of that. I mean, I was studying literature at the time, just as a student, and the language of that memorandum was the thing that horrified me and staggered me. This kind of cold, clinical language, totally detached from humanity. And so it was it was a process that really began it, and then it was. I also I won't duplicate everything I said at the conference because people can see that event online now, which is great that you've made that available to people. So, but the second moment was a few years later, really when we in Platform began to investigate what oil companies were doing around the world. And we became very, very engaged in the case of a brilliant Nigerian writer and activist called Ken Saro-Wiwa, who later, quite appallingly, was framed on charge. He was campaigning against what Shell and Chevron and other oil companies had been doing in the Niger Delta. And that became a kind of it was such a shocking moment, really, of horror, when he and eight of his colleagues were executed for campaigning completely peacefully against the activities of Shell and the environmental devastation they'd caused in the Delta. And I, at that moment, began thinking about how people in the Shell building in Waterloo in London could carry on going to work the day after those executions. And I sort of thought, what would you need to do in your mind? What kind of tricks would you have to do in your mind to allow yourself to continue to work for a company like that? And then a few years further on, I read a remarkable book by Gita Sareni, who I'm sure some of the viewers of this will know her work, which most of her work was spent looking at what we could call perpetrators, if we want to use that label, whether it's helpful or not. And she spent years interviewing Hitler's architect and later Minister of Arms Production, Albert Speer, about how he could get involved in such kind of barbarism. Because he was, unlike many of the other Nazis, he was actually a very intelligent, very educated man who saw himself as a very, very kind of humane family man, and so how he got involved in that process. And there's a remarkable section in that book where Speer talks about how Hitler required us all to compartmentalize our thinking. And that's something which, when I read that, I thought, well, that connects everything. It connects that memorandum in the film. It connects how the Shell directors could continue to go to work and the people at Shell the day after the executions. And it connects how Speer and, if you like, decent, and inverted commas, decent people could get involved with the project like Nazism. And so I felt at that point that compartmentalization in a way provided a key as a way in of looking at all of these things. And I still think that that's true. So that really is, that was over about a period of about 15 years that all those three things happened. And then I began to research intensively And I did about 10 years of research, reading everything I could find on perpetrator psychology. And also with the grant from Lannan Foundation, I was able to make these trips to sites of genocide in Europe, the archives at Auschwitz, the State Museum at Auschwitz, which were incredibly helpful. But went to Bosnia as well to look at how all of these um, things, horrors can happen. And I suppose one really important thing I want to make clear right at the start, Paul, is that I'm not talking historically. I use many examples from the last 200 years, but what absolutely captivates me as an activist is that these ways of compartmentalizing and this kind of behavior is absolutely in our corporate world, totally in our corporate world today. We could look at the psychologists who advised the process of waterboarding at Guantanamo Bay under the Bush administration. We can come right up to date. We can even think about people in pharmaceutical companies. It's very interesting. This man who was killed in New York a couple of days ago, who worked for one of the big health companies, private health companies. Somebody forwarded me something that's just been written by a New York-based journalist saying that, using my term of the desk killer, perhaps we need to find a new language to look at people who never kill directly, but whose work, whose kind of daily work, without seeing their victims, without killing directly, can have devastating effects. And I that's what interests me as a kind of activist as well as a writer. It's how we can change the psychology of people working in organizations and companies today. That's absolutely critical. Sorry, that's rather a long answer.
Yeah, that's excellent. And so, I mean, before we kind of look at some of the psychology of them, how about you? I mean, what was it that really attracted you to that? Because it's been taking an immense amount of perseverance and courage for you to really pursue this, and to live with you must have been haunted by some of the things you were discovering. I mean, how have you been able to get through those traumas, if you want, vicarious traumas?
The paradox, Paul, is that it's a very odd thing to say, but I'm an incredibly optimistic and positive person, and so it's a kind of, I don't think I could have done that work if I didn't have that the joy in the world and the absolute beauty of the world, and it I think it's partly to do with in one way, I think the trigger for looking at what shouldn't be looked at, if you like, or what's very difficult to look at. It was probably the experience of growing up with my father, who had 2 years as a young man between 18 and 20. And he did national service in the early 50s, and it was his incredible misfortune to be. That was the time of the Korean War, and my father fought in Korea and had a horrific time there. I mean, it was completely a traumatic experience, as you might expect. And the thing was, my father was an academic, a classicist, and a very open man. And he would talk about almost everything, but he never, ever would really talk about what happened to him in Korea. And strangely, I think I write about it in the book. I think it was probably my father's silence about those horrors. And I think children are incredibly perceptive. And I think children, we pick up on what our parents are silent about. And of course, whenever there are silences in families, I think things come back to the surface. And I think it was probably his inability, which I totally understand now, by the way, but his inability to talk about that kind of horror that he had witnessed, that actually led me to being interested in that subject and wanting to look at what cannot be talked about. And I was also very, very fortunate. When I went to university, I had a remarkable third year where I was able to study with a very young, brilliant young tutor who suggested to me, doing the tragedy paper, which we had at Cambridge in the third year, why not look at modern tragedy? Why not look at the literature of the Holocaust? And so I spent about 6 months reading everything I could find to do with the Holocaust, Primo Levi, Jean Emery, books that had just been published on the Łódź Ghetto at the time in the 1980s. And that was a remarkably formative process for me, and one that I'm very grateful for. So I got involved in really through that very personal thing to do with my father, and then maybe more to do with the third year at university and coming into contact with that great writing to do with the Holocaust.
Yeah, it's amazing. I think that's a fascinating thing. You wanted to give voice to that which your father couldn't give voice to, and once you got into that, I think that's important that we understand the source of our passions, really, because it's obviously to carry you through that. So it's almost like doing something for him in a way, as much as for yourself.
Yes, in a way, that's true. That is true. Yeah, yeah.
It's incredible. And how has it affected you, do you think? I mean, you say you're an extraordinarily optimistic person, but what has it done to you in terms of your thinking about humanity and the future and so on?
I mean, you're asking this question, Paul, at a time when I think for many of us, the world has never seemed darker. I mean, we're at an extraordinarily difficult time. And I'm sure, as you've had since the re-election of the man who I used to call the sociopath. I didn't even use his name, but I just called him the sociopath. But we know who we're talking about. Since his re-election in November, the world has lurched towards something more authoritarian. And in Europe now, we see in many countries, we see in Austria now the biggest party is the far right. In France, it's the second largest party, and in Germany, in the February elections, the AfD will probably become either the biggest or the second biggest party. So we're at a time which has never been grimmer in a way politically, and this lurch towards populist, simplistic solutions and authoritarianism. So it's a hell of a challenge. It's a hell of a challenge to retain any kind of hope at the moment. But I find the most hopeful thing is in the questions and analysis, and trying to provide people with frameworks, or at least providing some kind of analysis where people can start to hold powerful bodies to account. And I do find that hopeful. And John Berger writes a lot about the greatest moments of hope come in the darkest times. And I think he's absolutely right about that. So at a time when the world is in real crisis, I think it's ever more important on those of us who are looking like you're looking in terms of the compassion focus. And I'm looking, okay, it's very connected to what you're doing, but I'm maybe looking more from the harmful mind aspect and how that comes about and how we can find ways maybe to prevent that. But I do think without the questioners, we're being at a far more difficult situation. So I'm very, very committed to working with as many other people around the world as I can work with, to provide at least to provide the questions and give people the way of holding power to account, if that makes sense.
I think that's so important. And I mean, from our point of view, the problem is humans evolved in small hunter-gatherer societies of about 150. Once you get above that and you start creating groups and tribes, compassion can be absolutely destroyed when it becomes between group hostility. There's some very interesting studies that you probably know where you can look at what happens in the brain if you show people somebody having their hand pricked with a pin. Now, if the person thinks that the person who's having the hand picked with the pin is on the same football side, supports the same football side, all the empathy systems light up, they're one of us. But if you say, no, that person is a member of another football team who you don't like, it doesn't light up. The empathy systems simply don't light up. So when you've got this idea of the outsider or the other or that which is not you, that which is not like me, once you've got that, you can pretty much do anything. And so when you talk about compartmentalization and what the right wing do very well is they create around immigrants or whatever, they're not like you.
Yeah.
They're not like you. And once you've got that, then you can start to manipulate and turn off compassion systems. So I think the point and what you write in what you say in your writings is so interesting about how people get these distinctions. Yeah, but they're not like me.
Yeah.
You talked about how a particular mobile gas chamber was modified, and they referred to people as objects, I think, or units.
The load and cargo merchandise.
They're not like me. They're not like me. And once you that breaking of that empathic connection is very, very dangerous. So
I mean, I did it actually, Paul, to be self-critical for a moment. I did it a few minutes ago, which it's so easy to do because when I talked about Trump as the sociopath, of course, that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm switching off my ability to be empathetic. Now, that's an enormous challenge. If you're on the left, to try and find any empathy for that man is a staggering challenge. And yet, I have actually asked myself the question, what created that man?
Yeah.
And he had an extraordinarily authoritarian and bullying father. And he had a childhood which was predicated on money and materialism solving all problems.
Yes.
And I've actually thought of him because I know people in New York who knew him as a young man. And I've actually thought of that man growing up in New York, and how he felt himself to be small, made to feel small by people who were more academic, maybe more intelligent than him, and how he then created that kind of internal rage that one day he would be revenged on these people who had made him feel small. And I do think it's a huge challenge to treat somebody like that with empathy. It's absolutely an extraordinary challenge. I'm not minimizing it, but I do think we have to. And this is maybe, I mean, I was brought up as a Catholic. My father was a very serious kind of liberation theology, left-wing Catholic. But he always said he was incredibly, as all of us were, as I'm sure you were as well. I mean, sort of on a gut level, opposed to everything that Thatcher stood for and Thatcherism and the chaos that caused and still continues to cause, I think, in our society. But he would always say, you cannot write off a person just because of their political label. You have to take the person seriously. And he was guided by St. Augustine's famous comment, you hate the sin, but not the sinner. And I think that's something I've also been guided by in a way. But although I'm incredibly tough on the actions and the responsibility and the crimes that people have committed, and that will, of course, will come across in the book, I also try to make that distinction between not writing them off as human beings and trying to find the humanity and the empathetic connection if it's at all possible to do so, and that's also the dividing line. I spent so many years very, very involved in activism, and I became more and more troubled at the way that many of my fellow activists would literally mirror the behavior. And they'd talk about, them, these people, these evil people in the corporations. And they simplify, and in doing that, they simplified them in an incredibly dangerous way, I think, because it doesn't minimize you holding somebody to account by talking about what actions they've done and their criminal responsibility. You don't have to then take away their humanity. And I think that's really important.
No, I think that's absolutely essential. And the point that you make, and you use the word compartmentalization, but the brain is very tricky, and it absolutely does that. It compartmentalizes. We have disorders called dissociative disorders, and that tends to make it a pathological, but actually humans do it all the time.
Yeah, yeah.
All the time. I mean, and if they're not engaged with being desktop killers, I mean, what is this fascination with horror films? Why are we so entertained by watching people being tortured? Okay, we say it's a fantasy, but when people are watching it, they're not thinking of it as a fantasy. They're actually imagining it. So this fascination with causing harm is really quite a serious issue if we can, and therefore one of the reasons I'm very attracted to your work is that you help us understand how does compassion get turned off, because
Yeah,
a compassion system in the brain, if you turn it off, it's like driving with no brakes. We're in trouble because there is no regulator then, and that ability to turn that motivational system off is actually quite easy to do. That's what for me was so frightening from your book. It's so easy to turn
yeah.
compassion off. There is no sensitivity.
But I don't think we quite understand, Paul, how that process happens of turning off. It's funny. I was rereading a little section towards the end of the book today that I haven't looked at for a while, and maybe I could just read a short passage because it relates directly to what you've just said in terms of how these things switch off. Um, this was I've had this image has been in my mind for many, many years, but I'll try and describe the image for you. I see a man, mid-40s, coming back from his work in the City of London. It's a soft summer's evening, so there's no need to put the car in the garage. He can hear the sound of his children's voices coming from the garden, and he feels an acute sense of well-being as he walks around the side of the house, only pausing to smell the honeysuckle he planted last year. Earlier that day, the man, high up in one of Britain's leading oil corporations, had presented the final spreadsheets in a report to the board of directors. The report's recommendations were accepted. A stretch of coast the length of Cornwall in southern Nigeria will soon be developed. He cannot connect this fragrant evening in the leafy fringes of the home counties with his work earlier that day. He cannot, or perhaps will not, allow himself to connect his life with the lives of those in Nigeria about to be affected by his work, the simple action of tapping figures into a computer in an office in the city. If we could discover what happens in the mind of such men and women, then change might be possible, change of an unimaginable kind. I've never believed that the majority of those working in corporations or powerful organizations of any kind are evil at all. So my starting point is the human being. I have no doubt. My starting point is the human being. Remove the label of corporate and say that people are not primarily defined by what they do, but by who they are. Accept that the woman or man who leaves their home in the morning to go to work is not a different species to you or I. They too may be worrying about a dying parent. They too could be puzzling over a friendship that seems to have cooled. They too might be wondering about the meaning of their lives. The inner voices that come to us in the early hours. What do you really want in your life? Is this love or is it more like companionship? Is this what you've settled for? I have no doubt that the man or woman leaving the house in the morning is not so far away from the doubting, compassionate, puzzled, loving person sketched above. They'll also be juggling lists in their head, checking texts and emails, thinking about the shopping they need on the way back this evening, the babysitter for tomorrow night, the mobile phone that needs replacing. Basically, a human being we could recognize in all their messy reality. But then something happens. And it happens between the pulling of the door shut at home and swinging into the lobby at work. Something shifts in the mind. Something switches. Something is suspended. And it's considerably more than a move between the private self and the public self. Something is closed down in the journey between home and work. Something profoundly dangerous occurs. The ability to love, to suffer, to have human relationships is put away into a safe box until the end of the day, and such emotions now do not have to impede the business of business. It's as if the people have somehow given themselves permission, at least for the next hours, to put their empathy away put their compassion in a sealed box.
That's
I, yeah.
absolutely brilliant, Dan. Yes, absolutely brilliant. That switching from one context to another, that contextual switching or the switching of roles, and that almost our minds organize our potentials for anger and compassion and hatred in different ways when we switch context. A different pattern emerges. That's absolutely right. So I think we do see it happening, and it tends to happen more commonly in people who've got traumatic histories. But and of course, those people also go after power, they seek power. But there's a whole range of other processes, I think, which are really important, which is this, which you also talk about, which is the complicity, how we get into complicity. I mean, what's also interested me, as you know, is this whole issue of religion and the way that religions have over a millennium, and many religions have a concept of hell, the idea of internal suffering. I mean, who on earth would come up with that and believing that's okay? That's okay to have a God that creates hell for eternal suffering. No, it's not okay. What is it that allows us to think that's okay? And we want to continue to worship a God like that. Why would we do that?
But it's admirable. I mean, you talk about the religion. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, I grew up with Catholicism, and thinking about it now, it seems so extreme.
Yeah.
We went to mass every Sunday, and as a little child, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, I was looking up at the walls at the Stations of the Cross, which had 12 depictions of a man being tortured
Yes.
on the cross. And yet, there was supposed to be somehow that was supposed to be something we thought was kind of not only I don't know, right, or suffering was essential. The death, life came through somebody being killed, and then through the sacrifice of Jesus. I mean, in a way, I think if you think about how religion works, and just that example, it's quite staggering that we put children through that process.
It's busting.
That's what's normalized. I mean, that's what's, you're talking about, why we like horror films. Well, why do we worship in churches which have depictions of torture like that?
And I mean, all over the world now, there are religions that are just horrific. I mean, they're just doing horrific things in the name of their religion because they say it's in the name of the religion. They can treat women in a certain kind of way or whatever it is. It's okay. I mean, so your book really speaks to processes that are just everywhere. Everywhere you look, these processes of turning off compassion and giving ourselves permission to be harmful and callous to people because we want them to do things in a certain kind of way. It's everywhere. I mean, it's probably, what you're writing about is the greatest challenge to compassion. And we need to work out how that is and what it does and how we can turn it off. Now, towards the end, sorry, yeah.
Can you talk more from your experience as a psychologist in terms of how that ability to switch things off, as I described in that passage, that ability, how does that, what is your understanding of the psychological processes by which that happens, by which that is possible? That the same person can be, as we know, from, say, take an extreme example, the commandant of Auschwitz, Rudolf Hirsch. There's been a film about recently, and we know, he read his children books, stories. He was, quite a loving father by some accounts. Yet he goes to work, and 300 yards away, he's organizing one of the greatest mass murders in the history of humanity. And yet he comes back to the villa on the edge of Auschwitz, and he reads his kids bedtime stories, and he laughs with them. Now, what is actually going on in the mind in a kind of chemical way? What is your understanding about, or is that something that we just don't yet have enough data on, or how that process happens?
I agree. I don't think we have that much data from a chemical point of view. We know that parts of the frontal cortex break down. We know that part of the systems that normally respond to empathy, they get turned off. So we can identify bits of the brain that seem to be turned off and other bits of the brain get turned on. the point is, though, that if we are that contextually sensitive, what do we do to create contexts? I mean, like Assad was an eye doctor. Milosevic was a doctor. I mean, these are doctors that go on to actually create horror. And there's also, of course, all the stuff on the Nazi doctors and the experiments they were doing, so on and so on.
Book. Yeah, the Nazi doctors. Absolutely.
Even if you presumably have some kind of compassionate orientation, how can it be so turned into its opposite? I mean, it is extraordinary. So even if you start off with reasonably noble pursuit in life, you want to be a doctor, you want to save people, nevertheless, that doesn't protect you from becoming an absolute killer. So I think the question you're asking is a very, very important one. I'm not sure I can answer that question.
As a completely non-psychologist, Paul, and you may remember from the conference when we showed this slide. Over the last 20 years or so, I've come up with these sort of 10 categories, but I don't know how much these are. Because I'm not a scientist and I don't have the enormous level of knowledge about psychology that you and your colleagues have, but I came up with these 10 kind of them in layman's terms. What do I think is going on? And these are incrementalism, normalization and peer conformity, language and dehumanization, abstractifying victims, moving from individuals to anonymous masses, distancing yourself from the act of violence, transferring personal responsibility to the authorities' responsibility, compartmentalization of thought, workaholism and the narcissism of frenzy, prioritization of abstract systems over the human being, and looking away or willful ignorance. And those 10 kind of categories I explore at different points in the first book, and in fact, 3 of them will be in the next volume. But those kind of, would you? I mean, do you think I'm on the right lines with some of those 10, or do you think there are other things that need looking at? Or, I mean, I know it's a hugely complex area, but I mean,
no, they're very important. This whole issue of tribalism and othering, how the boundaries can be very small actually, and how they are not like me. You need that sort of element. That's very true. And the other point that you make, I think, is also, which we haven't talked about, is that we are basically a primate that lives in hierarchies.
Yeah,
Used to hierarchies are dominated by aggressive males and that sort of thing. And therefore, submissive behavior is very easy to trigger in us. And we just become compliant in a submissive hierarchical organization. So when the organizations are hierarchical, they create context for what you say is passing authority and responsibility up the ladder. And I'm not going to rock the boat because I'm in I don't want to be kicked out of the group or persecuted from above. So all of those processes, I think, are very, very powerful. And this issue of the hierarchy of power and how we engage in submissive behavior is Stanley Milgram's work, which I'm sure you know, all of that stuff. So that submissive preparedness to turn off one's preparedness to disobey, to say no, to rebel, to fight against authority, for some people, that is very difficult.
I mean, of course, in the Milgram experiments, the men in white coats, the authority figures, they were the ones who said, no, the experiment must continue. But, in the interests of science, the experiment must continue. And so that was the sort of deciding factor in many of these people then applying what they thought were the lethal levels of electric shocks. And there's another example which really, really stayed in my mind about Eichmann. Eichmann visits Himmler and is told verbally that Hitler has decided on the final solution, the physical extermination of the Jewish people. And Eichmann questions it. And Himmler says, no, it has been decided. The Führer has decided.
Yeah.
Okay, that is okay. If the Führer has decided, that is okay. So there's an absolutely extraordinary example of the deferral to the authority.
Yes, that's right. But that, particularly for men, I mean, it happens with women as well, of course, but that within male groups, that deferral to dominant male authority, particularly aggressive dominant male authority, and you see it in criminal gangs, you see it in all the way through, it's really pernicious. It's very dangerous. And within those structures, people are simply cowards. I mean that's a derogatory term, but they even if they had doubts, they learn to suppress those doubts. There's a wonderful book by Hamilton and Miller called Crimes of Obedience. Now, and this is the way in which we do things because other people are doing them or because we're told to do them. And once we're in that mindset, it's like our own individuality gets turned off. The other point is that these authorities nearly always contextualize what they're doing as protection. You're protecting your group. Like one of the reasons that we're moving to the right is because the right wing have got onto the issue of immigrants and that we need to protect our societies. We need to protect our resources. They're taking over our jobs, they're filling up our hospitals, blah, 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 all that stuff. And so now we can stimulate the hostility to immigrants, not because we're just being unpleasant, but because we're protecting our communities. Now it's protection, you see. So we also give ourselves positive reasons for being hostile. And of course, Hitler used that all the time against the Jews, that we're protecting the German race and it's the Jews that really undermined us and took away all our resources and they stole from us and all that stuff. So those processes, hierarchy, the fear of opposing hierarchy, being part of a compliant group, you're going to get kicked out of the group, seeing what you're doing not as horror to the others, but in some way you're protecting yourself or getting vengeance. I mean, what you've got on in the Middle East right now, this is wars of hatred. This is not wars of security anymore. These are wars of hatred and vengeance. And you're simply not going to be able to solve those unless somebody outside is able to bring these groups together to find some way to deal with this hatred. It's hatred driven. So, the key thing with all the stuff that you're talking about is all these different ways in which this capacity for compassion gets turned off.
Yeah.
And there's lots of different ways. And how do we address that? So that might be something for us to move on to now. How do we start to address these problems?
Well, and of course, the defenses are so strong around the existing order and the existing hierarchies. The defense structures are staggeringly powerful. I mean, I talk in the book about doing setting up a series of interviews, which I did at Birkbeck and with a business college in a triangular research partnership. And some of these interviews, we were interviewing people from pretty high levels in Shell and BP and other oil and gas companies. And some of these interviews took about a year to set up between the first communications to the people and them actually stepping through the door of that little room at Birkbeck so that I could do the interviews. And I was so struck by one particular person. I won't obviously identify them, but this person was very, very senior at Shell as a legal, one of the most senior lawyers at the time of the executions of Ken Saro-Wiwa and the other 8. And this person turned up. First of all, I got a message on the day. This is after a year of trying to set this up, saying, I've decided that I cannot do the interview with you today because I'm very concerned about I've found out more information about you and your organization. And, so after all of this effort, this person was threatening not to come. And I had traveled about 7 hours the day before to get back to London for this interview. So I said, no, and I think it's really important that you do come. We don't have to do the interview, but come and we can talk. And we ended up having a really brilliant conversation, really interesting. But the person was shaking when they turned up. This is an extraordinarily powerful person. They were physically shaking because it was as if they were breaking the mafia silence, the omerta, the oath of silence. And as we talked, what struck me was the religious background and the way this person talked about how important religion was to them. And yet, when we got, I've done quite a lot of work now, Paul, with people from senior levels in corporations, and particularly the oil industry. And I do an enormous amount of thinking about how to create safe spaces where you can have conversations that are very, very difficult to have. Where and one of the first things I do is I try to uh, if you like, confuse the person by they're expecting a very hard line, politically condemning line of attack. And instead of which, I give them warmth, humanity, empathy. I want to know what they were like as a child. With all of these interviews, I start off with what they were like as children, studying geology or being fascinated in art or math or whatever it is. And then you trace how the step by step by step by step in which they got involved in the company and then got promoted and then became really very, very high up in the organization. And what was remarkable in these interviews with 6 of these very senior people, and these are tough corporate people, 4 of the 6 actually started crying or became or started welling up. And I was absolutely staggered at, if you take people through a process, it was in a strange way. Of course, I'm not I'm not in any way a therapist, but in a strange way, it was like doing a process, not a world away from the psychotherapeutic process, with these people, tracing them through from childhood when they had ideals and clear values, to being involved in an organization which had been responsible for the deaths of hundreds and hundreds of people in Nigeria, and exploring what that felt like to them, what that
Mm.
felt like. And it was absolutely fascinating, and it's a process that I want to continue. I'm trying to continue it at the moment with having somebody in London who's works a lot with in the area of corporate, trying to make corporations more ethical, which is a hell of a challenge. We're developing some other kinds of safe spaces where these conversations can happen. But I suppose I have a doubt about this as well, which I would love to hear your thoughts on, because we had an exchange after the conference where we were talking about how brilliant it would be to engage senior levels of business and maybe the CBI and people who have real power in these kinds of conversations, because the conversations I'm having are with individuals who are they're not the top 10 people in the company. They're below that level. So I've asked all of them, if you think this process is a good one that I'm taking you through. And by the way, nearly all of them have read the book, which amazed me. The people I'm dealing with at the moment, they've read 1,000 pages of I You We Them, which I think is it's not something you would expect somebody in business to do necessarily, but they've really engaged, Paul. And the challenge I've left with them is I need to have the same conversations I've had with you, with your chief executive or your chief financial officer, and these need to happen on a Saturday or a Sunday without anybody else apart from me and this person connecting as human beings. And we'll go for a walk on Hampstead Heath, or we'll go outside London, and we'll suspend time for a day. We won't have our mobile phones with us. We will simply talk. We will walk and we will talk, and we will have a conversation. Now, that's a kind of mad idea, because these senior people are so defended. How do you get to them? How do you even get 15 minutes with somebody like this? But I think, I don't know, maybe I'm approaching it in the wrong way, but maybe we need to be having these kind of conversations with the CBI or with the organizations that I don't know. What do you think? Do you think that's a crazy thing I'm trying to do there, or do you think there's some possibility of creating change through that process?
No, I think it's brilliant, actually. And you are correct. You're moving in the psychotherapy, and good that you do too. One of the interesting things is that when you say that people become tearful, is in order for us to be able to recognize when we're doing harm, we have to have the capacity for guilt. Guilt's very different to shame. People confuse this all the time. And one of the things you have to be able to do with guilt is to have a sense of remorse, or possibly an anticipation of remorse, or possibly an anticipation I'd feel bad if that was to happen. And what we know is that, particularly, it's clear in the prisons, that if people have not processed their own grief, their own trauma, like, losing a mother when they're 3 years old or whatever it is, those capacities for feeling emotional pain close down. They close down within them, right? And so they can't do guilt. They don't do remorse because they can't be in touch with that part of them that is in touch with pain and sorrow. They're not. And you're quite right. And when they begin to do that in therapy, they start crying and they say things, I didn't realize I was in this much pain. I really didn't know that. I didn't realize I was grieving so much. I didn't realize just how lonely I felt and unloved I felt as a child. My parents seemed okay, but they never really cuddled me. They never. So you've got a lot of people who are absolutely frozen when it comes to the ability to empathize with pain because they can't empathize with their own. And there's been studies showing that if you show pictures of people who are crying or upset, whatever, individuals usually kind of react to that. And if you show pictures of themselves crying, they react to that. But if you do it with these people, they don't react. They say, yeah, that's really unhappy. But there's no physiological, you can show them pictures of themselves crying. There's no physiological reaction. They're closed down. They just.
Well, it's exactly what Gwen Ad said I quoted in the book in a very interesting interview. She talked about working with the people as a forensic psychotherapist, working with the 200 people or so at Broadmoor for over many years. And she said almost without exception, those people, those men, they were all men. They were the survivors of a disaster. She uses this term, the survivors of a disaster, exactly as you're talking about, what had happened in their childhood. And I was very struck at the conference. You remember John Taylor's story, Simon's story, where he put together all the people he's worked with, and you got that sense of the incremental way in which people shut down when they experience trauma. And I thought that was brilliant. And so I think what you're saying is it's very it's very, very tricky territory, this. But if they're showing emotion, these people, that is a hell of a good sign, because it shows they have guilt. And if you have guilt, it shows that you then have a capacity to be responsible for your actions. That's the critical thing.
Very much. And you have to be able to experience sadness, the emotion of sadness. Crucial. If you can't do sadness, you can't do remorse, you can't do. So that's absolutely crucial. And that's why when you're working with them and what you see is they start to tear up, you're actually tapping into emotion they've frozen up.
Yep.
I need that emotion in order for them to sort of stand up against injustice and that sort of thing.
At a further stage, this is much more ambitious, Paul. This may take another 5 years to do. But at a further level, I would like to move from the individual approach that I've been taking so far to actually bringing together, kind of, if you like, people, as an example, people from the oil companies, at the high levels of the oil companies, with the people whose lives they have devastated or affected, the survivors. Yeah. And I would like to bring those people together over a series of days. It may take days. It may only be possible to do once these people have retired. That's the sad thing. Then they don't have power anymore. And at that moment of retirement, I've been fascinated at how much more open people become once they step down from their organization. Then they get the ability to be open and almost become a human being again. But of course, it would be extraordinary to bring those people together over a period of time, a day, 2 days, 3 days, and to connect up those two groups who've affected each other so much. And I mean, that's something I probably would need lots more. It would need a big project with people who are far more skilled in in psychotherapeutic processes than I am. But that's something I would be fascinated in doing, say, in the next 3 to 5 years. I don't know if that's something you might be interested
Yeah,
in.
oh, absolutely, absolutely with that, and John would as well. And the other area that people are looking at now is psychedelics, because people that have experiences of dropping some of the ego defenses and the sense of interconnectedness, that issue of interconnectedness just changes the way people see the world. And there's also a spiritual dimension to this, because the other aspect that freezes us, and this is in Buddhism, as you know, is that the Buddha, when he came out of the golden, or Siddhartha, when he came out of the golden palaces and suddenly realized that, disease, decay, and death were the three realities of life, he was absolutely horrified. He didn't like biological life at all. And really, because we've been wrapped up with these deity religions, that we can't actually see the reality of the lives. Our life is one of intense suffering. All of us have to face the realities of growing old. All of us will face injuries. All of us will face disease. All of us will die. All of us will have to face the death of people we love. In reality, life is a horror show, actually. And the way we find elements of joy in that is quite something. But we are in.
Yes, life and suffering are absolutely together. I completely agree.
We're in denial of that, you see. All of these guys, mostly guys, they're completely shut down from the absolute tragedy of life, that you will die. Everybody you love will die. Nothing, absolutely nothing you have right now will remain. That's it. No, I don't want to think of that. It's okay. I'll just carry on doing what I'm doing, and I'll just start enjoying my, my fast cars and everything. I don't want to think about that.
Yeah. No, I mean, I've had really, really interesting conversations in the last year or so with friends who are very problematized by other friends of theirs, and I've got people like this I know as well, who fill their lives with so much distraction. And this is where technology comes in as well, where people are on their screens the whole time, or they're getting little dopamine hits by getting something liked on their social media feeds, which is one of the reasons I've never done any social media at all. I'm incredibly concerned about the effects technology is having on all of us. But that kind of life of frenzy and filling up every spare moment is about not spending time with yourself and actually not having compassion for yourself. That totally disconnects you from the ability to reflect on your life. As my father loved Socrates more than anybody else, and so I got lots of Socrates probably growing up. And that concept of the unexamined life is not worth living. I mean, I have absolutely, that's what I've done for most of my life. I spend, hours as a writer. Of course, you're spending so much of your time is spent alone and thinking and reflecting, and of course that can, if you only did that, you'd become a monk or a hermit, and you'd probably go mad. So every month or every 5 weeks, I need to go to London and see friends and go out drinking and go to films and or do all those kind of things. But I am very critical of people I know, and I'm sure you know many of these as well, Paul, who literally fill up every moment so they to avoid being with themselves, being alone.
Yes, absolutely. Because then the reality of what it is to be a biological being, because life actually, all life has to eat other life, viruses, and 99% of all species have gone. They've gone extinct. There's been 5 or 6 mass extinctions in the history of this planet. Life is tough. I mean, it's harsh, right? Coming to terms with we've been born into not a paradise or this wonderful thing created by a loving God. Absolutely not. It's a hardship. That's very difficult for us to come to terms.
I agree with you. I wouldn't use the word horror show. I would just say that I would say there is also a staggering. I mean, if I turned this tablet round, this laptop round, you'd see sun on Cadair Idris and all the mountains of Snowdonia and the Irish Sea and I've got birds flying to the feeders below, which is how I start every morning. Instead, I used to meditate, Paul, and now I spend 20 minutes every morning simply watching, completely absorbed by watching the birds feeding and the interplay of light and the clouds on the sea and the mountains. And that is my way. And starting without any news for the first 4 hours of the day, without any involvement in what's going on in the world, with some music, classical music in the background, and this absolute absorption in the beauty of the world and the natural world. And so when you asked me earlier, when we started the interview, how do you cope with this horror? I do it through friendship, which is incredibly important to me. I mean, really, really close friendships, and a very close family. And I do it also with the staggering beauty of the mountains, the sea, and animals, wild animals. And that gives some kind of other space in which I can then engage in the kind of subjects we're talking about. And I don't allow that to completely dominate or take over. I feel like it becomes out of balance. And at those moments, I get to London, or I get to my friend, or I go walking with friends of mine, or I get out. I know when those times are coming, and I get kind of overabsorbed. And at that moment, I need to have those other spaces. But
I think that's a brilliant observation, is because on the one hand, you're able to understand, or you're able to experience the beauty of the world. And that's created by, our minds create that experience of beauty and so on and so on. At the same time, you're able to enter into the dark side. That ability to move like that, that's rare. Not many people can do that in the way that you've done that. And you're absolutely right. That other aspect of the spiritual dimension of life. What is the spiritual dimension? Given the reality of biological life is a bit tricky, to say the least. What is the spiritual dimensions, and the ability then to, as you say, appreciate the senses of the sunset, the smell of the sea, of other. That's such an important element, because one of the things humans do is we create experiences. I mean, if you think about, for example, before Mozart, that music had never been heard in the universe. And then Mozart gives rise to Beethoven. Beethoven gives rise to Rachmaninoff. These are all totally and utterly new experiences. The taste of pizza, never experienced in the universe. One of the things humans do all the time are create these new textures of experience. So this capacity for love and awareness, and these are amazing things that we can texture our minds with. And that's what really, I believe, spirituality is about. But the dark side is the biological mind that keeps pulling you back into tribalism, genetic replication, all of that stuff. And so the question is how do we help people to make that transition between not getting caught up in the passions of the biological mind and begin to see more of the spiritual dimension you talk about when you look out and you see the sunrise and so on?
I mean, it's very funny. When I started writing the book, I talked a lot to John Berger, who became a great, the last 15 years of his life, we became good friends. And John said to me something which was such a useful lesson. He talked about how there are some books where you agree politically with the writer, but they just want to cram in so much information that it doesn't give the reader an ability to breathe. And so when I started writing the book, I wanted to absolutely include these moments for the reader, which were, okay, there's some traumatic things in the book, but after those chapters with really traumatic material, I try to provide humanity, beauty, light, hope, love. And so the reader can navigate, as we all do in everyday life. We navigate between the horrors and the difficulties and the challenges, and then we have the light and the love and the beauty, and that way we can make a journey which we felt we could never make at the beginning, through that process of creating the space to do that. And that was a wonderful thing that John taught me, in terms of and I hope the way, I mean, of course not everybody, it won't be everybody's cup of tea, but but the way I've written the book should read much more like a novel than a book about I mean, my agent said, Dan, I would never have read 1,000 pages about genocide, but the way you've written it is more like a Russian novel. You've got life in there, you've got friendship, you've got walking, you've got philosophical reflections, there's everything in there. And so that was lovely. I mean, that's what I hoped readers would take from it in that way, that sort of sense of an epic journey, really, but with this lightness as well as the looking at the difficult sides.
Yes, I think that's right. And we're coming to the end now, so we want to talk a little bit about some of what you have as your host. But one of the things you guided us through is that even though humanity has a history of terrible darkness, and the people that you've talked to are one of trillions of people over the millennia, no doubt, who will do these things. Nevertheless, if we can help people be in touch with something which is linking to their own sensitivities, their own emotional pain, and they can tolerate that, and if they can then begin to think about outside of the domain, maybe the spiritual dimension or whatever you want to call that, there is absolute hope that these systems that get turned off in the brain can be turned on again. And once they're turned on again, then people do take an interest in others. They are concerned about not causing harm. So, I mean, I think it's a lovely journey you've taken us on. So, last few questions then, because I know that at the end you talk about Spear, who had talked to, I can't remember, was it Callias? Somebody, Carlos, and he began to show some signs. I mean, it might not have lasted, I don't think, but some signs that he was developing some sort of empathy and understanding. So, what your view, and obviously one of the reasons you want to work with these people in corporations, is that there is quite a lot of hope in what you write, actually, about what we can do to become aware of and then address the harmful mind. So how do you see things panning out? What would you like to see?
Wow, goodness. Yeah, I think there is real hope when you look at somebody as sort of compartmentalized as Speer was in those 3 years in Spandau prison after the war, and he asks this Protestant chaplain who was sent to the prison. He asks him, "Would you help me to become a different man?" Which is an extraordinary question, and one that Casalis took very, very seriously. And Casalis then said, "I will do it with you. I will try, but on one condition, and that condition is that you open your mind and spirit to suffering."
Yes.
And that's a hell of a thing. That line is so remarkable and so beautiful that he actually got Speer to do that for these 3 years, and it is staggering if you read the diaries, and if you read and also Cathalis talks to Gita Sereni about the process, and you get this opening up. It's like watching somebody open up, and he's suddenly thinking about strangers who his work impacted upon, people he's never met. He's thinking about people in his family he hasn't thought about for years. He's opening to the world. He's reading novels. He's reading theology. He's trying to grapple with this question of evil. What does that mean when we lazily use that term? And it's a remarkable, moving process that Casalis manages to get Speer to do. And I suppose in microcosm, that's inspired me in terms of thinking about working with people who you could simply write off and say these are selfish, greedy, authoritarian people who want to work at high levels of corporations, and why should we spend any energy on them? I think that's absurd. We have to keep the humanity of people all the time there, however terrible their actions have been, and however much responsibility they bear. Keep the human being in mind all the time. And I suppose on a more immediate level, I would like to get, I really would like to get this analysis of, if you like, the desk killer as a concept. I would like to get that much more into public discourse. It's very encouraging to see it being picked up all over the world. I'm getting sent little messages about somebody here is called a desk killer, and there is called a desk killer, and Alistair Campbell was challenged on national radio a couple of years back, which was wonderful. Hearing an interviewer on BBC Radio saying, have you thought about your responsibility for the Iraq War? because you're what in this new book that's come out, you could be called a desk killer because of the work you did to legitimize that war. And Alistair Campbell is completely lost for words. So what is great and exciting is seeing these ideas being taken up and being used by writers, activists, journalists all around the world. And I hope that increases. I've got some specific projects, apart from the ones I've talked about these working with people in corporations. I've got a second volume to come out, which I'm editing at the moment, by UE Them. I've also got I've got a possible project which is in its early stages at the moment of talking to a man who interviewed Speer when he came out of Spandau prison, and has got 40 hours of recordings which have never been made public about. So this is an absolutely extraordinary, and it's a remarkable coincidence. He lives about 6 miles from me in Wales, this man. So it's staggering. So I'm thinking about maybe doing a film about that, that aspect. And then, I'm also thinking, this is a more recent thought, but I'm thinking I started writing about how Trump came to power 8 years ago. I wrote a short piece called The Darkening Days. And I'm thinking of going back to that piece of writing because it's incredible. I reread it recently, and I think it's very, very powerful. It's talking about darkening political times and how Trump came to power in the first place, and how he was enabled to come to power by very liberal organizations, actually, like Random House giving him the biggest advance any publisher's given any writer in America in the 1980s to write that book called The Art of the Deal. Now, that was given to him by a liberal left-wing publisher in New York. So enabling that man to gain that sort of national platform. So I'm thinking about going back to that and finishing that. And that's a piece which would intertwine reflections on how we deal with very, very troubling aspects in our own lives, like depression, and trying to support friends of ours who are going through that process, with how we deal with profoundly troubling political times like we're in at the moment. And in that piece of writing, I talk about I make very, very particular parallels to what was happening in Germany in the late 1920s, early 1930s, and how extraordinary it is to see parties that are regarded as completely fringe parties. For instance, in 1928, the Nazi Party got 2.8% of the vote in 1928. And 4 years later, it had more than 30%. So how these fringe parties that we regard as kind of lunatics maybe become mainstream, I think that's very, very important. So there's a kind of more politically urgent thing that's coming in to me now, saying maybe you should work on that in the next year or two and get that one out there to help people. Because most of all, Paul, rather like I'm sure how you approach your work, it's about trying to help a fellow strugglers in life and fellow activists and fellow people of goodwill to come up with ways of analyzing, questions to ask, how we hold people in power to account and create a better and more compassionate world. I mean, that's the fundamental thing that we're trying to do.
That's the fundamental thing we're trying to do. And on that note, how to create a more compassionate world, understand the dark side as you have done, but also understand what it is that can bring people into a compassionate frame, to get those systems in the brain turned on, because they've all been turned off. Dan, it's been a privilege to talk to you, and just amazing work you do. Continue, and we look forward to interviewing you when your second edition comes out and other projects. So for now, thank you, and we'll see you again shortly, I hope.
Thanks so much, Paul. And it's been I really enjoyed the conversation. I hope we can continue to work together on projects in the future.
Yeah, no, I'd love that. Yeah, I'd love that very much. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much.